The most dangerous people are not the most wounded. They're the ones whose wounds are protected by power. We often call them leaders without realizing that they're incapable of guiding anyone. And the most dangerous part is that they don't look dangerous at all. You have probably met some really dangerous people and didn't even realize it. Maybe your gut instinct tried to warn you. You felt a subtle discomfort, a slight sense that something wasn't right, but you dismissed it. You told yourself you were overreacting. You gave them the benefit of the doubt. You trusted the image they presented. The truth is, sensitive, perceptive, generous people are often the most vulnerable to this pattern because they assume others possess the same inner depth and self awareness they do. And that blind spot can be costly. It's heartbreaking because these dangerous individuals don't simply misunderstand you, they consume you. Not necessarily physically, even though they can certainly be physically dangerous too, but they consume you psychologically and energetically. I saw this pattern very clearly in power heavy environments like academia, systems where intelligence, prestige, and institutional authority shield profound inner disconnection. Systems where power, political, intellectual, institutional, becomes an excuse for lack of self awareness. In these places, someone can appear highly competent, highly respected, even brilliant, while being entirely cut off from themselves. And that's the critical, tragic flaw. Not the fact that these people are wounded, we all are. The danger is not the wound, it's the fact that one, the wound is never looked at, and two, it becomes protected by success, by status, power, intellectual brilliance. When someone is disconnected from their own inner reality, from their own heart, they lose the ability to assess external reality as well. They don't feel impact, they don't feel doubt, they have no way of registering the consequences of their actions, and that makes them extremely dangerous. Once you understand what you're looking at, you realize something deeply unsettling. These individuals are not rare, they're everywhere, and it's imperative to know how to recognize them. To understand why these individuals are so dangerous, you have to understand something pretty destabilizing about human nature itself. Wounding is not rare, it's universal. Every human being carries injury, psychological, emotional, existential, and most of this injury comes from childhood and the family we grew up in. Wounding in itself is not the problem. In fact, examined suffering often produces depth, self awareness, and real wisdom. So the problem is not the wound, not at all. The problem is a wound that's never acknowledged, let alone examined. Because an unexamined wound does not disappear. On the contrary, the personality reorganizes itself around that wound. From a very early age, our wounds begin to shape perception, behavior, identity. They do so quietly but structurally. This process is inevitable. That's how our subconscious works. Psychological maturity requires confronting these wounds and dismantling the personality structures built around them. But most people never do that. Most people never go through that process. And here's where it becomes really treacherous. The most dangerous individuals are not only wounded, And they're not only unaware of their wounds, which is already pretty common, even though it shouldn't be. The most dangerous people are wounded, unaware of their wounds, but also externally rewarded in ways that protect them from ever confronting those wounds. So they may be intelligent, charismatic, successful, respected, powerful. Their competence in this scenario becomes the armor. Their intelligence becomes insulation, and their success becomes ammunition and immunity at the same time. They receive constant external validation while remaining internally unexamined. And that combination is extremely dangerous because external validation removes the only pressure that would otherwise force self-confrontation. External validation protects the wound from ever being examined. External validation allows the wound to remain untouched. And when the wound is untouched, it remains unintegrated. An unintegrated wound does not stay passive. It determines how the person behaves and relates to others, how they exercise power, how they interpret reality, how they justify their actions. And because they're rewarded by the external world, they experience no reason to question themselves. Their wound becomes fortified and protected by their success. And this is the most dangerous psychological configuration. Not woundedness, as we said, but woundedness protected by power. Because when someone cannot confront themselves with honesty and with integrity, they lose the capacity to accurately confront reality. They lose access to internal correction. They become structurally disconnected from their own interiority, from the consequences of their actions, and from the living feedback that governs healthy human behavior. And when someone is disconnected internally, they cause enormous harm externally. This is what narcissism actually is. It presents like extreme self-love, but it's the ultimate self-separation. It's the absence of an actual self. The self becomes an object to construct, to protect, and to project, instead of something alive to inhabit. Nietzsche warned us about this very thing over a century ago. He observed that when someone wears a mask long enough, the mask stops being a mask. The mask becomes the face. The performance replaces the person. And when someone turns themselves into an object, they inevitably turn others into objects as well, often out of cruelty, because their need to hide their wounds is stronger than everything else. They cannot meet themselves, and therefore they cannot meet you. And because they cannot feel themselves clearly, they cannot feel the impact they have on others. And that is the real danger. The real danger is to inhabit a personality structure insulated from inner connection to their own aliveness, but fortified by external power, operating without the internal feedback that makes human behavior safe. And the more power such a person acquires, the more damage they become capable of causing, without ever experiencing themselves as dangerous. And that's the paradox. If these individuals were obviously broken, unstable, incoherent, they would not be as dangerous. They would simply be avoided. But that's not how this structure presents itself. It presents as the opposite. It presents as strength, as clarity, as certainty, as composure, as elevation. These individuals appears often as charismatic, confident, articulate, successful, impressive. They more often than not occupy positions of authority, institutional authority, intellectual authority, social authority, moral authority. They're often leaders, thinkers, innovators, or ideological figures. More importantly, they're individuals whose certainty dominates the psychological space around them. Because, on the surface at least, they possess structure. A structure that protects and projects their grandiosity, a structure that shields them from contradiction, and a structure that prevents meaningful feedback from ever reaching them. And from the outside, and we're all susceptible to this structure creates a powerful illusion because they appear, and that's why they're dangerous, they appear intensely alive, magnetic, unshakable. And this is exactly where discernment becomes critical. Because if you look carefully, what they radiate is not aliveness, it's intensity. And intensity can easily be mistaken for life because intensity pulls your attention, it commands your nervous system, it overwhelms your internal reference points. It's very hard, I'll be honest, it's very hard not to be mesmerized in their presence. But, and here's where discernment is critical, intensity is not the same thing as aliveness. Intensity pulls you, aliveness meets you. Intensity makes you smaller. Aliveness makes you more of yourself. Intensity dominates, aliveness resonates. Intensity overwhelms, aliveness allows space. Intensity feels like force, aliveness feels like presence. And when someone is truly alive, you definitely do not feel consumed by them. You feel more present in yourself. You feel elevated instead of depleted. But narcissistic intensity produces the opposite effect. It destabilizes your internal equilibrium. It pulls you out of yourself. It makes you doubt your own perception. It creates psychological gravity, and gravity is extremely seductive because intensity mimics certainty, and certainty is deeply attractive to a nervous system that is uncertain, especially in a civilization where many people have become disconnected from their own intuition, from their own inner signaling. They become disconnected. We have become disconnected from our own aliveness. They become disconnected from their own perceptual authority. And when you're disconnected from yourself, intensity feels like truth because it is louder than your internal voice. It feels more defined than your internal ambiguity. It gives you answers and it appears more stable than your internal sensitivity. And this is precisely, if you study cults and totalitarianism, this is how people become psychologically captive. And not because they're weak, but because they're perceptive but unequipped. And sensitive individuals are often the most vulnerable because they register intensity deeply, but they also assume good intentions. And they project coherence where none exists, and they're innocent enough to mistake force for depth. They encounter intensity and interpret it as aliveness. But intensity without aliveness is not vitality. It is structure without contact. It is performance without inner responsiveness. It is force without internal regulation. And force can be extraordinarily persuasive, especially when it's reinforced by external success, by status, by recognition, by ideology, by institutional legitimacy, by collective agreement. All these structures amplify the illusion. They make the dangerous individual appear real, grounded, stable, authoritative, but beneath this structure, there is a void. There's disconnection from internal reality, disconnection from the living feedback that regulates healthy human behavior. And when someone is disconnected from themselves, they can definitely not perceive others accurately. They only perceive others with a strategy in mind. They don't perceive them relationally. This is why narcissistic individuals are not just difficult, they're structurally unsafe because they're unable to register the impact that they have on others. And without that feedback, there's no internal limit to their behavior. And this is why intensity becomes destructive because it operates without correction, without reflection, without healthy feedback. The most dangerous moment is not when you encounter intensity, it's when you begin to doubt your own perception in its presence. Because when you stop trusting your own nervous system, you begin outsourcing reality to someone louder than you. And this is how psychological captivity begins. Not through force, but through seduction, through intensity mistaken for life. To understand why this personality structure has become so prevalent, you have to step back from the individual and look at the system itself. Because it is not merely a psychological phenomenon, it's a civilizational one. Modern civilization is not neutral in what it amplifies. It selectively rewards certain traits while quietly suppressing others. Modern systems reward performance, certainty, and image while never requiring inner reckoning. They reward certainty and dominance. They reward the ability to project coherence even when the coherence is totally artificial. And they do not require inner reckoning or even outer reckoning in order to grant power. A person does not really need to know themselves to be able to rise within modern system. They just need to be effective, they need to be convincing, they need to be structurally useful. Hannah Arendt described something similar when she wrote about what she calls the banality of evil. She observed that immense harm is often carried out not by visibly monstrous individuals, but by psychologically ordinary people who have become disconnected from inner reflection. People who perform roles without any contact, real, with their inner or outer reality. Modern institutions reward speed more than reflection, image more than integrity, certainty more than truth, because they crave certainty. Certainty stabilizes systems, while self-awareness and independent thinking destabilize them. A person who questions themselves moves more slowly. A person who examines their motives becomes harder to predict. A person who confronts their own wounds becomes less controllable by external incentives. But systems do not optimize for self-aware human beings. They optimize for functional ones. They elevate individuals who can perform competence consistently, project authority convincingly, and maintain psychological dominance within pre-existing hierarchical structures. Whether those individuals possess inner coherence is largely irrelevant to the system. In fact, inner conflict can become a liability because inner conflict or inner examination introduces hesitation, and hesitation slows performance, and performance is the primary currency of modern power. This creates a dangerous structural condition. The individuals most likely to rise within modern systems are definitely, usually, not the most integrated. They're often the least integrated. They're the most removed from the fabric of human life. And that insulation protects them not only from external criticism, but from internal confrontation. Their structure, their ego structure, becomes self-reinforcing. Success validates the personality. Validation strengthens the structure, and the structure prevents self-examination. Is a continuous feedback loop that's impossible to get out of. And this is how woundedness becomes institutionalized, unexamined woundedness, because our systems are designed to amplify what is effective, not what is conscious, not what is integrated, not what is alive, but what is effective. And effectiveness without inner contact can become extremely dangerous at scale because it creates individuals who possess enormous influence over external reality, over people, while remaining profoundly disconnected from their inner reality. Individuals who can create real harm. This is why this pattern has become increasingly common. Not because human beings have changed, but because the environment now rewards psychological structures that were once naturally corrected through relational feedback. This phenomenon transcends political categories, and this is very important. It just appears wherever performance is rewarded without requiring inner contact in corporate, academia, media, politics. And the more we see such individuals rise, the more they shape the environment itself. They normalize disconnection. They normalize action without consequence. They normalize performance without presence. They normalize intensity without aliveness. Until that very disconnection begins to appear normal, and that's where we're at in terms of our society, and aliveness begins to appear threatening. Being able to recognize these individuals is somewhat counterintuitive because when you encounter someone like this, first of all, you have to recognize that they're dangerous, but then the natural instinct is to try to confront them, to call them out, to expose them, to name what they're doing, to make them see clearly, to try to convince them that they're wrong and you're right. But this instinct, and I want you to hear me very carefully, this instinct is misplaced because protection does not come from confronting them. It comes from reconnecting with yourself. It comes from restoring your ability to accurately feel what's in front of you. When you're in contact with your own aliveness, you begin to notice things immediately. You notice the absence of real responsiveness. You notice hollowness. You notice when someone is performing a version of themselves. You notice when their words are structurally correct but emotionally empty. You notice when their presence does not meet you but manages you. And this is not something that you have to think about. It's something you perceive. Alive people, people in contact with their own aliveness, can tell the difference between presence and performance. But when you are disconnected from yourself, performance can easily be mistaken for power because performance is clear. It is structured, confident, certain, and modern culture trains you to trust certainty more than sensation. It trains you to trust appearances more than perception. So when your system detects something incongruent, you override it. You defer to the image, you defer to the perceived authority, you defer to the structure. And in doing so, you abandon your most reliable instrument of protection, which is your own perception, your own felt sense of being alive. This is why highly sensitive individuals are often the most vulnerable to this deception. Not because they're weak, but because they're open. They feel deeply. They register subtlety. They detect shifts in energy and responsiveness. But they've been taught not to trust what they sense. They've been taught to trust credentials, to trust status, to trust confidence, even when their own internal signal is telling them otherwise. And this creates an internal split between what they feel and what they believe they're supposed to accept. And that split is precisely where psychological imprisonment occurs. Because once you stop trusting your own perception, you begin outsourcing reality to external authority. There's only one way to close that gap to reclaim your aliveness. Aliveness is your ability to connect to the raw, primal current of life. It's the felt sense of being here. It's presence, which is the opposite of performance. Aliveness restores perceptual clarity. It allows you to recognize when someone feels empty. Narcissism is not simply arrogance. It's a personality structure organized around protecting identity instead of experiencing life itself. Everything for a narcissist becomes filtered through the preservation of the self-image. Feedback becomes a threat. Vulnerability becomes dangerous to them. Reality becomes something to manage rather than something to meet. And when someone lives this way long enough, they lose access to the living feedback that regulates human behavior. They stop correcting themselves, they stop adjusting, they stop feeling the consequences of their actions. And this is why external confrontation rarely works with them, because their structure is designed to prevent internal penetration. The only antidote is aliveness. Aliveness does not confront, it does not go out there looking for a fight, but it gives you a crystal clear sense of what's truly real. It restores freedom because once you can clearly see what is in front of you, you stop seeking validation from structures that cannot meet you. You stop negotiating with psychological configurations that are incapable of reciprocity. You simply step out of their field, not as an act of resistance, but as an act of clarity. You finally see clearly. Because aliveness recognizes aliveness, and it also immediately recognizes its absence. Once you see this clearly, something fundamental changes. Not because you learned some technique, not because you became more assertive, not because you cared less, but because you became able to see. And seeing changes everything. The moment you reconnect with your own aliveness, you stop being psychologically vulnerable to people who pry on your disconnection. You stop mistaking intensity for truth, performance for presence, certainty for coherence. You begin to recognize people as they are, not as they present themselves. And that recognition happens instantly. We don't even have to think about it. Your nervous system detects incoherence. And once that perceptual clarity is restored, protection becomes automatic. You don't need to confront, you don't need to convince, you definitely don't need to explain. You simply stop offering access to people who cannot meet you. When you're in contact with aliveness, you're no longer governed by image, authority, or psychological gravity. You're governed by reality, and reality is extraordinarily precise. It shows you exactly who someone is if you're willing to see it. If this way of seeing resonates with you, subscribe. This channel is a body of work devoted to restoring aliveness and the perceptual clarity that comes with it. It's not self-improvement, it's not performance, it's not ideology, it's connection with yourself, with reality and with life itself. And once that connection is restored, you no longer need protection because you're no longer available to what is not real.